from 1968 to 1970, Egypt, rearmed and retrained by Soviet advisors after the Six-Day War, engaged in a war of attrition along the Canal. The Arabs refused to sit down with Israel to negotiate a lasting peace, despite many requests. After heavy retaliation by Israel, a ceasefire was eventually signed, but nothing more. In 1970, the Israeli government agreed to Resolution 242, with Begin and the Likud party members resigning from the National Unity Government in protest. Although the resolution did not call specifically for withdrawal from all occupied territory, it certainly compromised the relationship of the Jews to the land promised to Abraham. Israel's endeavors to protect her people by diplomacy and concessions to Gentile powers has been a feature of her foreign policy from the inception of the state. She has yet to learn the lesson of so many disasters, including the Holocaust, that no nation, or collection of nations, can be trusted. That lesson was driven home again in 1973, with the Yom Kippur, or Day of Atonement, War of October 6th to 24th, or 10 to 28 Tishri, in the Hebrew calendar. Taken off guard by the simultaneous attacks of Syria and Egypt, on this most holy day of the Jewish year, Israel struggled desperately to hold on. Egyptian forces crossing the canal virtually wiped out the Israeli strongpoints. In the Golan Heights, Israeli tanks were outnumbered and overcome. As her planes took to the air, they were met at the front lines with the most modern Soviet anti-aircraft missiles, which took a heavy toll. As the days passed, reservists were called up and sent in to stop the enemy, and eventually the battle was turned. In the end, Israeli columns penetrated beyond the canal into Egypt and cleared the way to Damascus in Syria, thereby bringing about a clamoring for a ceasefire. At the height of the war, France and Britain placed an embargo on supplies of arms to the beleaguered Jews. The United States alone came to their aid, with new planes having to be refueled in mid-air en route to Israel due to European non-cooperation. The world community generally capitulated before the threat of an Arab oil embargo. When, at a meeting of the Socialist International Group of World Leaders, Israel's Prime Minister, Golda Meir, upbraided her professed allies for their betrayal of her nation. She was met with silence, broken finally by the words of an unidentified delegate. Of course they can't talk. Their throats are choked with oil. In the sequel, Israel, having suffered 2,500 dead, was pressurized to help extricate President Sadat from his political crisis by releasing her stranglehold on the Egyptian Third Army that she had surrounded. Disengagement agreements and return of prisoners of war were arranged with the help of US diplomat Henry Kissinger. It is interesting to note that at one stage in the lengthy negotiations, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia endeavored to give him a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, highlighting the root of the Nazi-based anti-Semitism that was, and is, still smoldering. The Yom Kippur War did not significantly change the unofficial Jew-Arab borders, but it did change attitudes. As Israel looked inwards to discover where she had failed to be properly prepared, a determination to avoid a similar catastrophe was developed. A realization of what might have happened had the pre-1967 armistice lines still been in existence led to a hardening of her stand on occupied territory. There was also created an awareness of Israel's vulnerability to political blackmail by countries upon whose cooperation she depended for the supply of weaponry. Succeeding years would see increasing emphasis on what Israel saw as an unfortunate necessity, an arms industry, to a stage where today it is a major employer. As of 2014, the industry is the sixth largest exporter of arms to other countries in the world. Relationships improved on the Egyptian front after the Yom Kippur War and the disengagement negotiations. It seemed as if Egyptian pride and self-respect had been satisfied by the fact that they had been able to severely maul the Israelis in the first half of the campaign, while keeping up tough talk on Arab rights to Palestine. Sadat agreed to the navigation of non-military Israeli ships through the Suez Canal. Israel progressively withdrew from the Sinai under negotiated conditions, limiting the amount of armaments both sides were allowed to maintain there. The election of the much maligned Menachem Begin as Israeli Prime Minister in 1977 led, through his invitation, to the visit of Sadat to Israel in November. A reciprocal visit to Cairo by Begin and the mediatorship of the USA, eventually produced the Camp David peace agreement in November 1978, the first of its kind since Israel came into existence. Egypt's more reasonable attitude, however, brought condemnation from the bulk of the Arab world. In much the same way as the recent 2020 Israel-United Arab Emirates peace agreement has brought from other Middle Eastern nations. The payoff for Egypt was in offers of USA aid and arms. In so doing, Egypt, the prophetic king of the south, took up a position outside the Russian camp, a position required by Daniel chapter 11 verses 40 to 43, which describe the onset of the last and fearful Middle East war of Armageddon.
And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps.
Notwithstanding events that have threatened the breakdown of the new relationship with Egypt, for example, the assassination of Sadat in 1981, and the Lebanon War of 1982, Egypt's final position with respect to the Russian king of the north cannot be otherwise. But if relationships were becoming less belligerent in the south, the opposite was true in the east and north. Under the protection of the Syrian and Jordanian governments, which maintained unrelenting hostility, terrorist raids against Israeli civilian targets proliferated. Over the years, the Arabs of those regions had found it useful for propaganda purposes to invent a new nation, the Palestinians, even though it has no historical basis. It is certain that had the Syrians, Jordanians and Egyptians succeeded in annihilating Israel in 1948, Palestine would have been carved up between them and not given to an Arab group called Palestinians. Jordan's claim to the West Bank territory illustrated the prevailing policy, but the fiction of a Palestinian nation has served the interests of Arab politicians well, excusing their failure to resettle the refugees from Palestine, thus attracting international financial aid, swelling the ambitions of thugs like the Palestine Liberation Organization, known as the PLO, and above all, exerting international psychological pressure on Israel. Thus has been created the anomalous situation whereby the Arabs, who did not flee the land in 1948, enjoy equal rights in Israel, protection, parliamentary representation, social service benefits and a relatively high standard of living in the land of the so-called filthy Zionist aggressor, while those who did flee now live in misery, squalor, and, often fear, in the territories of their supposed loyal Muslim brothers. The oil-rich Arabs and their international supporters, who have poisoned Middle East politics and the minds of several generations of children, have accumulated a fearful responsibility before God by their selfish cruelty. A convenient summary of the Palestinian question is provided by the expatriate Algerian political writer Abdul Razak Kader. The Palestinians, who are today refugees in the neighboring countries, and who were adults at the time of their flight, know all this, and no anti-Zionist propaganda, pan-Arab or pan-Muslim, can make them forget that their present nationalist exploiters are the worthy sons of their feudal exploiters of yesterday, and that the thorns of their life are of Arab, not Jewish, origin. Since that time, PLO rhetoric has buried the facts beneath a welter of lies, and has nurtured a generation imbued with a hatred for things Israelish, and an indifference to any claims to national legitimacy other than its own. The Palestine Liberation Organization itself was formed of a number of Fedayeen, that is Arab terrorist groups, which began to operate from Arab countries against Israel from the early 1950s. After 1967, the Fedayeen became concentrated in Jordan. They soon became unpopular with King Hussein of Jordan due to their usurpation of his authority. They were forcibly expelled between 1970 to 1971. Taking up residence in Lebanon, the largest group within the PLO, Al-Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat, assumed de facto authority in southern Lebanon, which became known as Fatahland. From there, numerous raids were launched across the border against Israel. One of the most infamous occurred in May 1974, when terrorists seized a school in Marlet, killing 26 people including 20 schoolchildren, with another 60 children being wounded. Fatahland also became a launching pad for rockets fired indiscriminately against Israeli settlements in Galilee. But raids were not limited to Israeli territory. And the world was witness to the murder of 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics in September 1972. There have been many other incidents since. In most cases, Israel has retaliated against the terrorists in an effort to dissuade them from further attempts. The United Nations has further stained its record by supporting these terrorist organizations. In November 1974, the PLO was endorsed as the legitimate representative of the Palestinians and accredited with permanent observer status. The rights of the Palestinians to national independence and sovereignty within Israeli-held territory were supported by the General Assembly, notwithstanding the PLO's criminal record and refusal to concede Israel's right to exist at all. But worse was yet to come. In November 1975, 72 states voted to condemn Zionism as racism. And this while Arabs in Israel are free, and Jews in Arab lands are subject to discrimination and persecution. Among the 35 countries that opposed was the United States, whose representative rightly remarked,
"A great evil has been loosed upon the world. The abomination of anti-Semitism. As this year's Nobel Peace Laureate Andrei Sakharov observed in Moscow just a few days ago, the abomination of anti-Semitism has been given the appearance of international sanction. The General Assembly today grants symbolic amnesty and more to the murderers of the 6 million European Jews. Evil enough in itself, but more ominous by far is the realization that now presses upon us, the realization that if there were no General Assembly, this could never have happened.
28 years after the Zionism-inspired survivors of the Holocaust were promoted to statehood by the UN, that organization had officially and hypocritically countermanded its action. The moral bankruptcy of the UN was displayed for all to see. The resolution itself was repealed in 1991, following the demise of the Soviet Union, but it was clear that anti-Semitism of the World War II period was alive and on the increase. The emergence of a Jewish state had not, as some Jews hoped, changed the negative status of Jews in the minds of men, only provided a sharper focus. This accords perfectly with the biblical picture of the world immediately prior to Armageddon. The hardening of Israel's attitude on control of occupied territory as a result of the Yom Kippur War, coupled with anti-Semitic and anti-Israel propaganda, has resulted in a steady decline in international sympathy for her cause. Israel's war in Lebanon is an example of how Israel deals with mistakes it makes. The war had the objective of peace for Galilee, which started under Prime Minister Begin in 1982, and backfired terribly, bringing condemnation from all quarters, including from within Israel itself. It was allegedly a limited operation, provoked by the shooting of an Israeli diplomat in London. But it turned out to be a major war, planned well in advance by then Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, as a means of ousting the PLO from southern Lebanon and Beirut, expelling Syrian troops, and fortifying the Maronite Christian government by the extension of its control over the remaining factions. The ultimate prize in sight was a peace treaty and the normalization of relations between the two countries along the lines of what was being constructed, hopefully, with Egypt. But all arrangements for peace achieved by cooperation and identification with Gentile factions are bound to prove a mirage of unity. Sharon misled Begin and the Israeli cabinet on the scope of the war. Tempted by a dream that outweighed better judgment, Israel acquiesced at the start of the war, spilling her own blood and that of others, but in the end, was cheated of the prize. Even worse, the Israelis allowed the so-called Christian Phalange troops, who had refused to help in the war against the PLO, to enter the Palestinian refugee camps, where they massacred men, women and children, in sadistic revenge for the killing of President Bashir Gemayel. Israel found herself painted in the colors of a lying militaristic aggressor and promoter of a Palestinian massacre, and with some reason. But to her credit, unlike other nations, army morale disintegrated in disgust at its role, and the national conscience turned inward to censure itself and mourn the tragic losses. Human lives and principles are more precious in Israel than elsewhere. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to get notifications of new videos. Like, share and comment below.